A rotten culture that's institutionally racist, homophobic and misogynistic. The damning report into the Metropolitan Police. Triggered by the murder of Sarah Everard by a serving officer, the Casey report details a bullying culture, discrimination and a force that doesn't take violence against women seriously, that's allowed predatory behaviour to flourish.
We have to know that when a man shows us a warrant card and asks us to do something, that we can trust him, and that we have to be able to be sure that they are people of good conduct, and at the moment we can't prove it.
Also this lunchtime, Boris Johnson's partygate evidence is published ahead of his grilling by MPs. We've had a read of all 50 pages and we'll take you through the important bits. The age-old problem of potholes isn't getting solved anytime soon. Latest figures show it'll take 11 years to fix them all. And from morning suits to wetsuits, the wedding guests who ended up on a life-saving mission at sea.
This is the ITV Lunchtime News with Charlene White.
Good afternoon. Britain's biggest police force has lost the trust of the public. It's racist, sexist and homophobic. Those are the conclusions of a review by Baroness Casey into the Metropolitan Police, and it's damning and makes for grim reading. Whether you're a victim of crime or a serving officer who's been subjected to such appalling behaviour, this report says it's been allowed to flourish. It was, of course, the murder of Sarah Everard by a serving officer that triggered this report. Ian Woods has some of its most devastating conclusions and the reaction.
Sarah Everard, say her name!
Those who protested about the murder of Sarah Everard were right to be angry. She'd been killed by a serving police officer. Wayne Couzens may have been the most extreme example, but he wasn't unique. Dame Louise Casey's damning report has found that many in the Metropolitan Police simply cannot be trusted.
We have to know that when a man shows us a warrant card and asks us to do something, that we can trust him, and that we have to be able to be sure that they are people of good conduct, and at the moment we can't prove it.
The force was found to have failed to protect the public from officers who abuse women. Alleged rapists went free after fridges broke down, destroying all the evidence inside. And an overworked, inexperienced workforce polices child protection, rape and serious sexual offences. Sir Mark Rowley has spent much of his 6 months as Commissioner saying sorry for his force's failings. But he doesn't accept Baroness Casey's use of the term institutional.
I'm just not going to use the same language as the label that she uses. But it's a term that means so many different things to different people. It's not simply the ghastly fact that we have racists, misogynists and homophobes in the organisation, but actually it's also about we've got systemic failings, management failings, cultural failings, which has given them more licence to operate than we ought.
The report recommendations include greater independent oversight, such as drafting in independent experts, a dedicated women's protection service, and the Specialist Protection Department where both Couzens and another officer convicted of rape, David Carrick, served, should be disbanded in its current form. The Met failed despite being constantly in the spotlight ever since it was found to be institutionally racist following the murder of Stephen Lawrence. His mother responded, "Since my son's death, the force has had almost 30 years to put its house in order. It hasn't done so, either because it does not want to or it does not know how to." But both Baroness Casey and the Home Secretary insist that Sir Mark is the right officer to implement far-reaching changes.
It's incumbent on all of us now to get behind him, to support the progress that he is making in ridding the force of those corrupt or dangerous or offensive police officers who are not fit to wear the badge.
But the brother of Daniel Morgan, whose unsolved murder from nearly 40 years ago led to accusations of a Met cover-up, says the problem goes higher.
In my view, the oversight of the police has been terrible for decades. You know, the answer to the Home Office, and the Home Office has been useless for decades. So it's not surprised that all of this has suddenly bubbled up, you know, after all these years.
The government knows this is a national issue, not just a crisis affecting the capital. The Met doesn't just police London, it leads on national counter-terrorism, and erosion of public trust here permeates every other force in the country. Ian Woods, ITV News.
Now, before we talk to our guest, a former Met Chief Superintendent, let's take a look at some of the shocking evidence police officers gave. One officer says young female colleagues are traded like cattle and moved onto different units depending on which male officers found them attractive. One officer was beaten and raped multiple times by a fellow officer. She was so distraught by the handling of her case, she tried to take her own life. A gay officer was targeted with false rumours he took drugs and was involved in sexual relationships with senior officers. He said he doesn't trust the Met and varies his route home to avoid other police officers. A Muslim officer says he had bacon placed inside his boots and was worried about reprisals if he reported it. A Sikh officer had his beard cut off. The behaviour was written off as pranks and banter. And one officer said rape and sexual assault detection is so low that you may as well say it's legal in London. We're joined now by former Met Police Chief Superintendent Palm Sandy. Thanks so much for coming in. Can I just ask you about your reaction to those testimonies first?
I'm saddened by those testimonies, but I know that those have been carrying on for years and years and they haven't been dealt with. So there's nothing new in those testimonies and it will carry on. It's not going to stop.
It just seems unfathomable to, I'm sure, lots of people watching who haven't been in the Metropolitan Police to think that this has been going on for years in plain sight. And what, did the bosses think it was fine?
The bosses have never taken it very seriously, and if you raise your head and you try to deal with it, you then become the victim because the complaints procedure is such that you get false allegations made about you, you become ostracised, you're on your own. And although you're part of a police service of 37,000 people, it's a very, very lonely place to be. And even with those testimonies, you're listening to people who are saying, you know, there's no one to turn to, there's no one to talk to, there's no one to confide in. Yeah. And when they do confide, the tables are turned against them.
I spoke on the phone to a serving police officer earlier who'd read the report, and she said, it's a black female officer, and she said she found the report nauseating. When you read through the details, all the details of this report, what was your reaction to it?
The details are very upsetting. However, I'm really pleased that this report has come out. I'm really pleased at how strong it is and how strong the recommendations are. I'm absolutely over the moon that Dame Louise Casey has been brave enough to call it out as it is. But what I'm really disappointed about today is that the Met Commissioner is still refusing to accept the label of institutional racism, misogyny and homophobia. If you don't accept you've got a problem, you're never going to look for that solution, you're never going to put it right, which is why I say that this behaviour is going to carry on. I don't want to see the Met reflect. I don't want them to think about what to do next. I want to see an action plan, and I think that Londoners, the community and serving police officers deserve that action. Well, I mean, Sir Mark Rowley has sort of said that he found the review very, very worrying. And he's spoken about the different things that they're going to implement at the Met to try and deal with this situation. But you were in the Met Police for a really long time. So has Sir Mark Rowley. He's been there for 36 years. You know, Baroness Casey talked about the fact that they've been told to reform and it's unable to reform itself up until now. Sir Mark Rowley's been a part of the Met Police for 36 years. Is he part of a culture, therefore, that refuses to change? Do you need an outsider, perhaps, to come in and try and change things? You do need outsiders because the complaints procedures at the moment are all internal. You have police officers investigating people that they worked with a week ago or 2 weeks ago. There is no independence in the complaints. Very few complaints are actually referred to the Independent Office for Police Conduct. Most of them are managed in-house. So that is part of the problem. There's no independence. And when you've got a senior officer who's refusing to accept the whole report, how can that person then be part of the change? I mean, you talked about those 30,000 officers. The Metropolitan Police is Britain's biggest police force. Do you think it's a victim of that size? Do you feel like it needs to be broken up, perhaps? I think that through the leadership and the management, that might be the next step, and that might be the next viable option, because at the moment they're not managing it, they're not protecting even their own staff who are different. So if you can't protect your staff, what chance have you got of protecting your communities? And policing is by consent. Consent has dropped down to below 50%. Confidence in policing has dropped down to below 50%. So how can you possibly have consent?
And very quickly, yes or no, do you think the Metropolitan Police can change?
No, I don't.
OK, Palm Sandy, thanks very much. Ahead of his grilling by MPs tomorrow, Boris Johnson's partygate evidence has been published. In it, he accepts that he misled Parliament over lockdown gatherings, but says he didn't do it intentionally or recklessly. Our political correspondent, Romilly Weeks, has been reading the so-called defence dossier.
Boris Johnson has outrun his critics on many previous occasions, but this is lining up to be his biggest test yet. And today, the defence the former Prime Minister will rely on against allegations that he misled Parliament was finally published. In it, Boris Johnson first admits this. I accept that the House of Commons was misled by my statements that the rules and guidance had been followed completely at Number 10. But when the statements were made, they were made in good faith and on the basis of what I honestly knew and believed at the time. I did not intentionally or recklessly mislead the House. The Sue Gray inquiry into parties in Downing Street during lockdown found that many of the events should not have been allowed under the COVID rules. Despite being fined for attending one of them, Boris Johnson claims this. I did not believe that any of the events that I personally attended were in breach of the rules or guidance. I honestly believed that these events were lawful work gatherings.
No COVID rules were broken.
And when he made that and other statements to the House of Commons, he claims he was just repeating what he'd been told. I relied on assurances I'd received from my advisers, and it's clear now those assurances were wrong. As Prime Minister, I'm reliant on advice from officials. There's nothing reckless or unreasonable about that. Opposition MPs are not convinced.
It was obvious to everyone who saw what was going on. It was obvious to the police, it was obvious to Sue Gray, it's obvious to the public. Boris wrote the rules. It should have been obvious to him.
Some of Boris Johnson's allies have suggested the process is a witch hunt. The government insists the committee must be allowed to do its job.
I have confidence in the Privileges Committee to do that work. It's a cross-party committee. It has a Conservative majority on the committee. It'll produce its report and then it'll be a matter for the House of Commons. It's not a matter for the government.
Did your old boss Boris Johnson mislead Parliament?
Boris Johnson's former colleagues will be given a free vote on the committee's decision and any potential sanctions they recommend. The former Prime Minister will have 4 hours to give his defence in person tomorrow. It will have to be the performance of his political life. Romilly Weeks, ITV News.
Well, we're joined now by our UK editor, Paul Brand. And Paul, this sets up quite the encounter with the committee tomorrow, isn't it?
Yeah, because these 52 pages of evidence are pretty extraordinary to read. It's clear that Boris Johnson is up for a fight at tomorrow's committee hearing. And his main argument, as Romilly set out, is that he didn't deliberately mislead MPs. He did mislead them, but not recklessly, not purposefully, for 3 main reasons. One is a reason we've heard many times from him before, that he thinks these events were necessary for work purposes, that they were all working hard in Number 10, they had to come together for meetings, and that was an exceptional circumstance. Secondly, that his aides continually told him that these were not rule-breaking events. So when he went to his aides for advice, when the whole media storm blew up around Partygate, they said to him, look, you can say with absolute confidence in the Commons that no rules were broken. That's quite key. That's quite new in all of this. But then the third point that all this leads on to is, wasn't it just completely obvious to Boris Johnson, because he attended these events, that they weren't really within certainly the spirit of the rules and actually under the law? Many of them, of course, were found to be rule-breaking. You know, if you were a supermarket worker, a nurse, a teacher, and you'd gathered with your colleagues with alcohol on the table, with food in close proximity, and your boss had walked into the room, what would you have expected your boss to do in that situation? Well, Boris Johnson joined in. It might only have been for a short time. He said he didn't know how raucous it became later, but he joined in. Now, he says that if it was so obvious to him that it was rule breaking, he wouldn't have allowed an official photographer to take photos of the event, for example. I think that is where a lot of the debate will focus tomorrow, and it's going to be acrimonious.
OK, well, we wait and see. Thanks very much, Paul. Teaching unions are urging Ofsted to pause school inspections this week following the death of a head teacher. Ruth Perry was head at Caversham Primary School in Reading, and her family say she took her own life in January following an Ofsted report, which found the school to be good in every category apart from leadership and management. This has triggered a storm of protest. Well, today, plans to refuse Ofsted inspectors entry to a nearby school were reversed. Our reporter Charlotte Breer-Edney is at the school in Newbury in Berkshire. Charlotte, there was a silent protest there this morning, though, wasn't there?
That's right. Many teachers, schools and parents have been left deeply shocked by Ruth Perry's death. She had been a teacher her whole life, and in a statement released by her family this morning, she was described as kind, dedicated, passionate and a force for good. Her family blamed what they called the intolerable pressure of Ofsted inspections for her death. Well, this morning, a silent vigil and protest was held outside the John Rankin School behind me, with the head teacher here had wanted to prevent an Ofsted inspection from going ahead, saying she wanted to take a stand and make change happen. In the event, Ofsted staff have been allowed into the school to perform their duties, but teaching unions say carrying on with inspections at this time is the height of insensitivity, and they have called on for a whole review of the Ofsted process.
Is it really right that we've got an inspection system that piles such pressure onto our school and college leaders? And there are ways that that could be reformed. Labour is talking about that. The Church of England is doing that. Independent schools are doing that. We need Ofsted, I think, and the government to say enough is enough in terms of a disproportionate impact that Ofsted is having on too many leaders.
Well, those calls were echoed by Ruth Perry's family, who described the Ofsted inspection regime as deeply harmful. They wanted to put teachers' welfare as well as children's welfare at its heart. This morning, Ofsted said they're deeply saddened by Ruth Perry's death, but this has sparked a nationwide debate. Of course, inspections are critical to the way in which we evaluate and maintain standards at schools, but many say this should be a watershed moment.
Charlotte, thank you. Just Eat has announced plans to cut around 1,700 delivery drivers and 170 head office jobs. The spokesperson for the company says the group is reorganising and simplifying its delivery operation, and there'll be no impact on consumers. They are the scourge of drivers, cyclists and pedestrians, but the potholes on our roads just aren't getting fixed and won't be anytime soon. A survey has found that funding shortfalls for pothole repairs have reached a record high, and it would cost £14 billion and take 11 years to fix them all in England and Wales. Our consumer editor Chris Troy reports from Manchester.
Well, as you can see, and no doubt here, there is some highways maintenance going on today. According to the new report, there's far too little of this going on. In fact, one key fact from the new research is that over the last 12 months, the number of potholes being filled has actually gone down from 1.7 million to 1.4 million. Well, joining me now is highways expert David Giles. David, what are the main findings of this research?
Well, yet again, we find that local authorities have got insufficient money to properly maintain their roads. And so there's a huge backlog of work that's built up. Over 14 billion is the cost now to put our roads into a good condition.
But hang on a minute, in the budget, an extra 200 million went to the pothole fund. Will that make much difference?
Well, of course, filling potholes doesn't solve the problem of not having the money to maintain the roads. And if you imagine that 200 million spread across over 100 local authorities, each local authority will only get a tiny amount of money.
Just answer me this. If somebody's got a particularly worrying pothole in their area, how do they get it fixed? How do they move it up the list if it's perhaps dangerous, for example?
You can call the local authority highways department. Some of them have hotlines where you can register that pothole, and they'll push that up the list, especially if it's dangerous.
David Giles, thank you very much indeed. Well, you can probably see that the work here is going smoothly. Pity, of course, we can't say the same thing for very much of the road network around the country.
Chris Troy there. And finally, to the wedding, where the vows were interrupted because some of the guests had to dash off for a life-saving mission. The lifeboat volunteers slipped out of their morning suits into wetsuits as they took to the seas off Pothole in South Wales. Sally Biddulph has the story.
Thank you so much. Honestly. So honestly, I was in church. Yeah, one of the lifeboat guys are getting married. Oh no! But it's all right. It was before the sermon.
Not your textbook greeting from a member of the RNLI to two people stranded on a beach during a rescue. But then last Saturday was a special day for the Pothole lifeboat crew. Let's back this up a bit. It was the wedding day for Reverend Mark Broadway, a lifeboat volunteer, and his new wife Jessica. In church, friends, family, and a lot of emergency pages.
I reached down and I could see some of the other crew members in front of me. They were starting to shuffle around a little bit as well. I picked up my pager, had a look, and it said task and request by the Coast Guard. And at that point, I think instinctively, about 5 of us, a couple in front of me, a couple behind me and myself, we discreetly exited stage right, left the church.
The crew scrambled, swapped suits for survival gear and headed to the rescue. Battling a high tide and dangerous swell, they needed support from the Coast Guard rescue helicopter, which airlifted everyone to safety, even making it back in time for the reception.
I was out in the back somewhere and kind of hitching up my dress and running out the front, you know, and it was just such a lovely moment to see everyone all a little bit kind of wet from being in the sea. And
we went and gave all the crew a hug, didn't we?
Yeah.
And it was really good to see them back, and you know, to know that they'd gone to do something really important, you know, and it was so good that they were able to do it.
That's where we got the lovely photos as well, which is really nice.
As for the new Mr. and Mrs. Broadway, well, the pager is staying at home for the honeymoon. Sally Biddulph, ITV News.
Oh, what a beautiful picture. Right, that's it from us this lunchtime. Lucrezia will be here with the evening news at 6:30. The news where you are follows the national weather. But from everybody here and the Lunchtime team, bye-bye.